A bit behind on schedule, but we're going to try to make up a little time here and get back on track, make sure we have enough time for everybody to have lunch and everything. As Sean mentioned, there's lunch across the street here. If you're into sushi, it's very good. There's a couple other restaurants really close by. So,
we should have a reserved spot over there across the street for Mexican restaurants. We go
yeah.
for our group. So.
Yep. So feel free to do whatever you'd like for lunch, but there are several good choices really close by here.
I highly recommend Astro Burger down the street too.
Oh yeah, Astro Burger.
Awesome chef salad, hot chicken salad, like a
Yeah.
chicken.
I had an Astro Burger yesterday, and wow, it was like huge.
Introduce Renee.
I did not. This is Renee.
Hello.
Yeah. And you've been with Danes for how long?
Since 1982.
82. Wow.
I took a few years off in the early 90s to start my family, and then Danes Music moved out here in 1996.
To this building?
Yeah, that December they were closing the downtown store, and Skip called me on the phone and he said, Renee, you always said if I needed anything to call you. He said, we need help because it's like the last part of December and they were closing the store. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been reading Barney. I'm going to have to pull my Steinway book out.
Yeah.
So then in January we moved out here. We've been here since 1996.
96 in this building.
And then the hall was built in 2003.
As an addition?
This was our garage.
Okay, okay.
The furnace used to be right here. That
Yeah.
was a door for the trucks to come in.
Wow.
And they moved the furnace clear over there. And
That's
it's a
great.
beautiful room.
It is, yeah.
Happy to have you all here.
Thank you. All
Just
right.
so you guys know, tomorrow for lunch, we're trying to do the Brazilian place down the street as a group.
The meat festival.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Food festival.
Any of you that were here last year, you probably remember that. It's great food. It's Brazilian churrasco. It's great. Great. Well, let's jump into it because we are running a little behind, and I want to make sure we've got we cover a few things. Several things that Aaron brought up in his presentation just now, I think leads in very nicely to sort of this question of how do I make Piano Marvel fit into my studio? And I think that sometimes what's a challenge for piano teachers is that they see all the cool things Piano Marvel can do. But a lot of times teachers have a difficult time, or I should say have difficulty to envision what that's actually going to be like in their lessons and how they're going to work that. And so hopefully we can kind of break into that a little bit and get you thinking about that. So essentially, what would be like the ideal setup, perhaps, or the end goal? Well, I think that one step to that is going to be teachers would have a Piano Marvel setup for use in lessons. Okay, that's one component that you should have. If you want to teach with Piano Marvel, you should have it somewhere, at least one place set up with your MIDI-enabled piano or digital piano and either an iPad or a laptop. And I would recommend having that as a dedicated station, if you will, for doing Piano Marvel. Okay, so that would be the first thing I highly recommend. Next is that each student would have a MIDI-capable keyboard or piano at home. And I know that this is something, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but a lot of teachers have this reluctancy to ask their students to pay for things or to buy things. And, you know, Aaron just showed how easy that really can be. But again, he didn't jump in with a sales pitch. It wasn't like he was trying to sell you a house and saying, hey, I've got this house for sale. And you say, well, where is it? I'm not going to tell you that. Well, how big is it? I can't tell you that either. You know, is it in good condition? Maybe. You're right. You're not going to be very interested in buying that house with that kind of a sales pitch, right? So getting these students excited, jumping them in, don't even talk about price, equipment, any of that stuff. Just get them going. Get them excited. Get them playing some music. And then they start asking, well, what do I need to do this at home? Oh, you just need a keyboard. Oh, is that it? And a cable. Okay, where do I get that? right? It completely changes the mindset of the students and the parents. And really, when it comes to that side of it, it's really the parents you want to see. So what do we try to do in usually our first 1 or 2 lessons? Who should be there? Mom and dad. Now, you don't necessarily want them there in every lesson. I get that. But mom and dad, if possible, or at least one of the parents, if they can be there to see that, right? And you could see, what was her name? Maggie? Anna? Anna was the girl. Maggie. I mean, she was like, yeah, let's get this set up. Let's get this going. This is wonderful, right? And then that they each have a device. This is really pretty easy these days. A lot of these kids already have an iPad, or they have older laptops laying around that they could use and things like that. So how do we make this all happen? Well, we've thought about this a lot, and we have one recommendation. No, but there's other ways we think too. You could try that. It might help. But let's talk about lesson configurations really quick. So there's different ways, and Piano Marvel, as you might see it, is a very flexible tool and a very powerful one. You could use it in a one-on-one setting. This is where the piano teacher has it set up. The student comes in, and they can use Piano Marvel during the lesson as part of the lesson. They go home. They also have Piano Marvel set up to use it there. This is ideal, okay? Because, again, everything we've talked about that feedback, fixing the practice session, making it work, what Anna would be able to do on her own at home, right, it's so powerful, and it adds a lot to the learning environment. Another possibility, small groups. So I know Aaron often teaches groups of 3, 4, 5, sometimes more. Sometimes one, right? And if you look at like the lab back here, where we've got, I think, 6 pianos set up back there, you could run a class of 6 students. And I think every teacher kind of has to find their comfort level of how many students they would want to run at a time. We were working with a teacher not too long ago who was totally overwhelmed. She had like 60 students that she taught weekly, one-on-one, and she decided it was just too much. So she went, got some keyboards, pianos, had set it up in her home, and started teaching, I think, 5 or 6 at a time, and was able to cut way back. She reduced her price of lessons a little bit as a group lesson setting, but freed up a ton of her time. And she still does some one-on-one lessons with advanced students, but allows also for the group lessons as well. And if you think about the way that Piano Marvel works, individualized learning is a big push in education these days. Why? Because we've learned that not every student learns at the same rate, and some students are ready to move on. We've always categorized students by age and say, well, you're 8, so you're in this grade, and you're 9, so you're in that grade. Well, how many, it doesn't work that way, right? I've got my daughter, when she was 8, was ready for reading advanced books and mathematics and things. And my son, when he turned 8, he wasn't, he could go out and play sports, and he could do a lot of things that she couldn't do in that realm, but reading and math they weren't nearly on the same level. So you can use Piano Marvel to really individualize that learning process for your students. So it's really great. And we're going to have a session specifically on group teaching, right? That's at...
There's this afternoon, and tomorrow we have a breakout session.
So we'll have a couple sessions that talk about how it's used in group classes. It's really great if you're interested in doing group classes. Or larger classrooms, and that's, again, what Jared Pierce is doing. We have some teachers who teach in public schools. There's a great example is Lubbock, Texas. We have a teacher down there. He runs 130 students on Piano Marvel every day. So he has class every day, blocks of 25 kids at a time that are using Piano Marvel all day long. There's not a lot of schools, unfortunately, that allow for that much music, especially keyboard, to happen, is a scenario that Piano Marvel can fit in. Or online. Now, both Aaron and Sean have done quite a lot of online teaching using tools like Skype. And if you think about it, it changes a few things, but a lot of that same, because they're using Piano Marvel and they have access to all those tools. A lot of what Aaron just did, by the way, when you were watching him, he was coaching and instructing, but a lot of what he was doing was teaching the student how to use the system. He didn't do, honestly, a lot of piano teaching if you just watched that. He didn't show her a lot of rhythms. He didn't show her, explain the theory. He, like we talked about earlier about, as teachers, we want to explain things to death, right? He, a lot of times, was just going in there and saying, oh, did you know you can do this with this button? Did you know if you click here, this happens? Did you know there's a video here? Before we knew it, she was doing it on her own.
Well, he was complimenting her intellect, every step of the way.
And he was analyzing what she was ready to learn next. And then when he felt she's ready to understand this, he gave it to her. But he wasn't forcing necessarily anything on her. And he was guided, yeah. He didn't just throw a bunch of information out there. So sometimes this question comes up. My students are already paying for lessons. I can't ask them to buy anything else. And sometimes when we're talking about to teachers about getting started with Piano Marvel, right? Well, first of all, right, they do have the free account they can jump in and start using right away. That's what, and Aaron, again, before even talking about what a subscription would be later on down the road, it was, let's just get in and start playing. Let's get familiar with this tool. But this question does come up. So the truth about that is that piano teachers frequently undervalue themselves, their talents, and the enormous impact that learning music has on their students' lives. When we hold things back from our students, even though deep down inside we know it's the best thing for them and we know that they should be doing it, but we're afraid to push them that hard and say, you need to get a keyboard, you need to get this set up at home, right? What you're really doing is you're undervaluing yourself as a teacher and undervaluing the value that you are bringing into their lives. If you know that this is what will make the best impact on their lives and everything, then asking them to get that keyboard, asking them to get that MIDI cable is not something we should hold back on. And we should be very forward and direct about our expectations with those students about that. Yes?
One quick thing for me, I am more of like I want to create opportunity teacher, but it gives me problems because parents aren't paying as much, so they're not as motivated to make their children practice. And as I've talked to other teachers, creating that investment, if parents realize there's actually an investment in this, they're more eager to make sure that their kids practice and then they're more on your team.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of what people don't realize. They're like, oh, can I really charge $20 a lesson? And for me, it's yeah, find the students that are going to pay you that $20 because they're going to be invested.
And that's the thing. And I think one of the points, thanks for bringing that up, one of the points that I think goes along with that is, you will occasionally find a student who's just going to say, I don't want to do all that. And, my experience in talking with lots of teachers around the country is that's pretty rare, but it sometimes happens. And, the thing is, though, is that what I've also seen a lot of teachers do is they say, well, I've got to get everybody on board. And if I've got a couple of students that are putting their heels in the dirt about making this happen, then they don't make it happen throughout their whole studio. And so what ends up happening is they end up denying their whole studio of these amazing tools just because they got a couple stinkers, basically, right? Well, honestly, in that regard, personally, I'd say, hey, I have this other teacher that I think is great for you. If that's the case, if it really came down to that. Because I don't have time and the energy to deal with that side of it. I would much rather say, because I can get other students into my studio who will say, what do I need to get? Okay, we'll go get that right now. And I will say also, it's very easy to get parents and students on board with what they need to get when they're first coming in, because you set the expectation right out the gate. It's harder to raise that expectation later, but it's definitely doable. There's a stigma about education that it should always be cheap or free. And we shouldn't promote this idea because it's sabotaging our own industry. We're teachers, but then we're also saying, oh, but don't pay for this and don't buy that. Well, we're basically promoting this idea that education should be cheap. And not to say that, and cheap in the sense of quality, as well is this consideration. But we have to understand that good quality education is something worth investing in. So what is the real cost of Piano Marvel when we think about it? Well, Aaron, brought up at the end $12 a month. So some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, I went to college and I'm pretty sure that this statement is inaccurate. Here's what I mean by this, is that with Piano Marvel by itself, we talk about the $12 a month if they're paying monthly. It's actually $8.25 per month if they're paying for the annual account, by the way. Pretty inexpensive. And let's say on a national average, somewhere around $75 a month for the lessons. So that's where our 12 and 75 come from. And the point I'm making here is that when you combine the two, it's not a summation, if you will. When lessons are combined with proper implementation of Piano Marvel, the resulting progress is not represented by addition but multiplication. And that's what we mean by that. So they enhance each other so much that, as Aaron just showed, he had a student down here playing this piece that her mom wouldn't have expected her to be doing that stuff in the first lesson, or the second lesson, or the third lesson, or the fourth lesson, and so on, right? But it's possible with the right tools. So what's the real cost? It's a tremendous value in that sense, because these students are able to get so much more out of their practice time and their lesson time. Yes?
Well, I convinced some parents because I'm like, look, method books are on the computer. You're not buying that.
Yeah.
There's a library full of a whole bunch of songs that you're not purchasing. It's
Yeah.
like you're saving money.
You are. That's absolutely right. So not only are you saving the money on that cost of the books, but you're gaining so much more in the value of the whole lesson environment. And we have to think of outside of just the lesson as saying, well, I did my job, I showed them what they need to do, and I shipped them home. Well, if that's your thought process of teaching and what it should be, then we've got some issues there, of course. Can't my students just use Piano Marvel at my studio? We hear this a lot, and they get the idea of saying, I just want my students to come in, I've got a computer, and they just all log into one account, and or that they'll share that way, okay? So you can teach superior techniques, the most superior methods, the most superior approaches, and the most superior ways, but if students are not practicing effectively at home, it will hardly show. I wrote that. But it's true, right? If the practicing is not happening at home effectively, by you presenting your superior way, as they call it, and it's not going to matter so much. This question, can't my students all share an account? Well, sharing isn't always a good idea. And I created an image to kind of illustrate why sharing is not always a great idea. Sharing is generally a good idea, but not always, right? Sharing Piano Marvel accounts is not a good idea, similar to this. Let's see. The truth is that your student will lose the majority of the benefit that they can get from Piano Marvel if they're sharing an account with another student. So it's kind of like getting a trophy that your sister won or something, right? Not really all that exciting, not all that motivating, right? Has anybody experienced that where they've had maybe siblings or somebody like using the same account? Does that come up before?
Yeah, the second boy stopped.
Yeah, he stopped.
Couldn't keep up with his younger brother.
I was, about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I was a bit ignorant to this. And I had my son using his older sister's account for about a month, month and a half. And he quit. He didn't want anything to do with it. And I was figuring out why. So then I got him his own account. And he started blasting through the lessons because it was his progress. It was his trophies. It was his, everything that the scores and practice minutes and all of that he was earning.
How's the cost work with siblings then? Do they need to pay a separate?
They each, have their own account. That's correct.
My experience has been after having families that have 4 students with me,
Mm-hmm.
the first year there might be a little bit of, really? I'm gonna do 4 accounts? And the next year it's like, oh, I need to re-sign up, do it.
Yeah.
There's no hesitation, parents are seeing the progress right away.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. That's why Aaron showed them the progress first, then those questions were like, okay, this is worth it, So absolutely, and being direct with the students I think is important. Be confident in that decision. Parents and students will perceive that about you if you go in and say, well, there's this thing called Piano Marvel. I really like it. I think you guys might want to try it. It would probably help. Oh, they're going to be like, well, it's extra money. You don't sound sure about this, so I'm gonna pass, right? Yes.
So I just tell the parents that my students that are consistent on Piano Marvel progress twice as fast as the other students.
Yeah.
And that's not a lie.
Yeah, it's not a lie.
They progress because they want to get those hundreds, they practice at home, I don't have to tell them to practice, just like Aaron was saying.
Yeah. How many of you have experienced, by the way, because I know you all have teaching experience outside of Piano Marvel, I believe. How many of you have reached that moment when the student comes in to a lesson and they already know the notes and rhythms and you're like, what a relief. I don't have to sit here and go, no, that's a B flat, over and over and over, right? It's just all comes together in the lesson and you can move on. I actually think jumped ahead a little bit because I have a quote about that. But how much should I use Piano Marvel in my lessons? We need to break the idea that piano lessons have to be a painstaking process where students play what they worked on and wait for the teacher to tell them what's wrong with it. Okay, Aaron kind of hit on this point a little bit in his last session. Music lessons must evolve beyond a fix-it meeting to a fun experience that elevates the student's understanding. Again, keeping fun as part of it, but using the tools to guide that and facilitate that. Using Piano Marvel should not be an all or nothing thing in your studio. And this, I sort of touched on this just a minute ago, but what I mean is, again, if you've got a couple students that are dragging their feet about getting their keyboards, you shouldn't just say, well, I can't make this work in my studio because I got these few kids that won't get on board. Okay, you're denying all of your other students that could greatly benefit from this by thinking of it that way. So do what you need to do with those students, but if you know this is what you need to do in your studio, you've got to take charge of that and you've got to be in control of it. I actually already mentioned this, but imagine every student you teach enters the studio knowing the notes and rhythms. And then the question is, what would you do with your lesson time? Let me just ask that real quick. They already know the notes and rhythms. They've walked in the door on the piece that you're working with them on, or the exercises. What do you do with them then? artistry, the fun stuff.
Fingering.
Fingering sometimes, depending on, if they did that incorrectly, which can still sometimes happen, yeah.
It's all that stuff you mentioned that technology doesn't do well. That's where
That's right. Yeah, all this stuff in the last session I did talked about the artistry, the expression, the dynamics, all of those things that computers are just not suited for, right? You can focus on. I guess you could summarize it all into musicality. And it's interesting because sometimes when teachers are first introduced to Piano Marvel and they see how you play along with the accompaniment, they worry that, oh no, my kids are going to learn to play too mechanically, too rigid, too stiff if they practice this way. And our experience has been the exact opposite because, one, when they learn to play with that metronome and that timing, they're learning about where the timing is.
They're also learning how to listen. They're learning how to listen.
They're learning how to listen.
Fabulous about the accompaniment.
And I have to say a personal story from that. When Aaron and I, years ago, I come from a band background. Primary instrument is saxophone. And the first time I think Aaron and I ever tried to play something together, it was horrible. Because I think we weren't able to play together very well because I was used to, this kind of listening thing and I was trying to follow him. But I think the way that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way that you were trained a lot was not really so much about that, about listening to what everybody else is doing and playing and making it all come together. I've noticed since then, in years of, developing Piano Marvel and all that, that's something Aaron does extremely well, and he's really locked it in. He's really nailed it. But yeah, those are things that we find. So musicality can now become a huge part of your lesson, instead of fixing the mistakes that the students practiced out of their book because they didn't know how to do the notes and rhythms right. So your students now become more musical players when they're studying in your studio that way. What's that? Oh,
I was going to make an observation.
yes.
Oh, look, I have a microphone. None of you guys do. What I noticed is students learn in layers, line upon line, precept upon precept. And
So like
sometimes we want
onions?
to,
Like Shrek? He's like an onion?
yeah, like an onion. And so-
Sorry, no, ogres are like, what is it?
Ogres are like,
Ogres are like onions, isn't that it? I don't remember. Sorry.
have
That had
layers.
nothing to do with anything. Go ahead.
Anyway, they learn in layers, and so often we as piano teachers get too frustrated or impatient to wait for them to learn in their layers. And we start throwing more stuff on them before they're ready to learn. So this is really nice when they come in and they've got the notes down and they've got everything ready. It's like they're ready for this next musicality layer that we sometimes are just too impatient to wait for because we're sitting there watching them practice.
Well, and who wants to work on dynamics when they're not playing correct notes, or the chords are wrong, or the finger patterns are wrong, or any of that? We're so analytical as people that we feel like we have to fix that right away, and the problem is they've already made a bad habit of that when they practice out of a book. So then you've got to spend half that lesson breaking that bad habit, and that's still not going to be necessarily enough time for them to truly break that bad habit. And so it's like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back every week for those students, which can be really frustrating. So we're a bit short on time. One other question?
No, I was just
Oh.
gonna affirm what you said. I just had a student who was just really honest with me one time. She just looked me right in the face and she said, "It is so discouraging when I come to my lesson and I find out I've been practicing it wrong all week." She's just so mad.
Yes.
Really mad.
That's, and I'll give a quick analogy of that. It would be somewhat similar to if I was an English teacher and you're all in my English class and you're here and I say, we've got an assignment, it's due next week, you guys are all gonna write a 5-page essay and turn it in next week, but I won't. That would be frustrating, right? And our students experience that a little bit. I mean, not quite to that extreme, but it's a little bit like that, right? Where they don't know if they're doing it right. Who wants to spend hours doing anything if you don't know if you're doing it right? And that's one of the key things that Piano Marvel really solves for that practice session. So we're going to take just a minute to transition here, to get the next, yeah, I'll get that up.
No, anonymous genius Joel.
Yeah, thanks.
That was awesome.
You're welcome.
So, Nan Crowley, we're excited to have her in our midst. How many of you have used boot camps in your teaching? About half maybe? Great. There's specific scientific reasons why we created the boot camps. And Nan Crowley was instrumental in helping us kind of piece together some thoughts and some ideas on this. Anything from the popular piano solos in the Hal Leonard collections to the Christmas piano solos, the Learn to Play the Hymns boot camp, and some different pieces like that. There's very specific reasons and science behind the curriculum that we've generated with those boot camps. We're going to do a lot more. So while they get things set up, so we've done a lot with some of the Hal Leonard material, and we are very close. Can we announce a possibility that we're about 98% on the next stage?
I got word yesterday afternoon, it's a go.
Yay! Alfred. And so we now have access, it sounds like, to all, at least the majority of Alfred's content.